Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The Court of Appeal today upheld the High Court's July ruling, which convicted Najib Razak of 7 charges encompassing abuse of power, criminal breach of trust, and money laundering, all in relation to the 42 million ringgit from SRC International. A 3-person bench unanimously dismissed Najib's appeal to reverse the guilty verdict, but it had allowed a stay of execution for the 12-year jail term and 210 million ringgit fine. Now, this all pending Najib's appeal to the federal court. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be looking at the legal and political significance of this ruling. Our first guest tonight is lawyer New Sin Yu. Sin Yu, there's, I think, a general lack of understanding about the legal journey of this case and where the verdict sits within that journey. I'm wondering whether you can begin by helping us understand where the case goes from here.
Hi, thanks for having me. A typical criminal case will always begin at the trial court. And for Najib's case, it started in the High Court. So that's when all the evidence of witnesses are heard, the documents are tendered, and the judge had came to a decision and convicted and sentenced Datuk Seri Najib. So the next stage is the appellate courts. So appellate courts, there's 2 stages to it. The first is in the Court of Appeal, and the second is in the federal court if the case begins in the High Court. So where the case is at the moment, it's in the second stage, the middle stage, that is the Court of Appeal. So the function of the Court of Appeal is a bit different from the High Court in that it doesn't hear any more oral testimony from witnesses. All that it does is that it goes through the records of appeal. It's basically notes from what had transpired in the High Court, as well as going through all of the evidence that has been tendered at the High Court, and as well as analyzing and scrutinizing what the High Court had decided, what the High Court judge had written in his grounds of judgment. And then the appellate court would decide whether or not the conviction or of Datuk Seri Najib Razak was safe. And like you mentioned earlier, the Court of Appeal had decided that the conviction was safe and dismissed Datuk Seri Najib's appeal. The next stage will be the federal court. And this is the last stage for every criminal case that begins in the High Court. And in the federal court, it effectively plays the same function in the Court of Appeal, but it would then require to scrutinize what had happened in the High Court as well as the Court of Appeal. So once all that is exhausted, the decision is final. There will be no more courts to appeal to, and that's basically the end of the process.
Sin Yu, what was the defense strategy at the Court of Appeal, and can that be replayed at the federal court? Because we understand that they tried to bring new evidence and so on and so forth, and that was rejected by the Court of Appeal. Can they continue that narrative at the federal court?
Oh yes. They can make that application to adduce fresh evidence. But whether or not the federal court will allow that application, I think I can't comment at this stage. But all arguments or all issues that have been raised in the High Court, that have been raised in the Court of Appeal, it can be raised again in the federal court, and the federal court would have to go through all arguments that have been raised as the Court of Appeal did, as the High Court did. And ultimately, it's really up to the federal court to decide whether or not the conviction was safe, and whether or not the High Court or the Court of Appeal had committed any misdirection of law or facts. The defense doesn't have their hands tied. All these are available to them.
Okay, I want to kind of come back to the verdict today and ask, in terms of, say, looking at the stay of execution, whether that was expected, whether that was normal and reasonable or typical in cases like this, or whether in other cases there have been forms of restrictions placed on the guilty party?
Well, a stay of execution is actually quite normal, especially when the sentence involves imprisonment. And the logic really is that if a person is, or rather the accused or then convict, is required to go to prison while he still has an opportunity to appeal, and in the event he succeeds in his appeal, then his time spent in prison, it would be wrong. So a stay of execution is normally granted as of course when imprisonment is involved. So the stay of execution is quite normal, and Datuk Seri Najib, he quite deservedly gotten the stay of execution. That means he doesn't have to spend any time in prison or pay the fine of 210 million until his appeal to the federal court have been completed. So that's actually quite a normal thing to happen.
Okay. Right. The other thing that vexes some members of the public is the time it's taken to get to this point of the journey, and the question of how long it will take to get to the next and final leg of the journey. That, along with the fact that the courts had given leeway for somebody like Najib Razak to travel overseas, so on and so forth. I mean, are those things also fairly normal? He was charged, and only 9 months later the trial began, and so on and so forth. Is that all perfectly normal and reasonable?
Okay, I'll take that one at a time. As for the speed of the case, I think it's quite normal. In fact, there are cases where the entire appeal process, the trial process, it's taking much longer. I'm doing a case where it's been 10 years at the trial stage. So
wow.
So speed is not the word you'd use to describe it then.
Well, let's put it this way. This is a case of public importance, and I think the speed upon which the case is being disposed of, I think it's fair. And I think time alone shouldn't dictate whether or not it's fast or it's slow. What is important is the amount of time that is being spent going through the evidence, hearing the witnesses. As long as the defense is afforded a fair opportunity to defend his case, then even if it's completed in a matter of 6 months or 9 months, it doesn't matter. But how long it's going to take for the next stage? Well, typically it takes up to a year. But for this case, I'm really not sure. It really depends on the court's diary. Sometimes it can take much longer if the court is occupied with other cases of equal importance, you see. So that's what I think about. I don't think there's anything extraordinary or anything spectacular about the case.
Okay, Sinu, I'm sure you've gone through the grounds of judgment that was released, and I'm just a lot of people were struck by the phrase that was used, national embarrassment. I'm just wondering whether what you thought about that, and whether there's anything else in the grounds of judgment that struck you that you thought was important.
Well, to be honest, judges delivering their opinions on a case, like a murder, for example, a gruesome murder, for example, that's actually quite normal. Perhaps this is the first case of its kind where, the judge thought it was fine to say national embarrassment. But I think putting aside for a moment the sentiments surrounding this case, because there are many, today the Malaysian judiciary has upheld the conviction of a former Prime Minister. And I think that's something that is worth noting. And independent of the outcome, in a country where so much power is centralized in the executive, the fact that a former premier is put on trial, or has been put on trial, and has to answer the charges made against him, just like everyone else who faces criminal charges, shows that the rule of law is functioning in Malaysia. And this is what equality before the law really means. You go through the same due process regardless of your station in life. What do I think about the decision? Well, I've read the 50-plus pages press summary. I've not read the full judgment, which is 317 pages long. And I wouldn't want to comment on the merits of the decision because I'm sure Datuk Seri Najib is appealing. But I will say that it is a reasoned decision, and the Court of Appeal had painstakingly combed through the volumes of evidence in arriving at their decision.
Of course, we've had in the past, we've had in the past, a former deputy prime minister jailed and so on and so forth. So it's not that extraordinary. But I do want to ask you, if you have two cases, as with two levels, two courts have now found in favor of the people against Najib Razak, what basis could we have for him being acquitted at the federal court? Would it be a question of law? Would it be a question of evidence? How might that unfold?
Well, it can be both. It can be a point which the High Court did not agree with the defense, as well as the Court of Appeal, because the Court of Appeal basically affirmed everything that the High Court had found. And the federal court may arrive at a different decision. So that possibility is still there, and it does happen. There are cases where you lose in the High Court, you lose at the second stage in the Court of Appeal, and in the final stage, you win. And there are also cases where you won in the High Court, you won in the Court of Appeal, and then you lose in the federal court. And it really depends. But I think what's important is the due process rather than the outcome, because the outcome,
right,
as long as it is reasoned, then it is fine. So
a very quick one. Yeah. Sorry, Sin, we're running out of time, and I just want to ask you about where we go from here and the legal impact in the political future. Can Najib contest for a seat in GE15 if it is held before the federal court actually decides on his appeal? No,
that one thing is certain. Datuk Seri Najib is disqualified from contesting in the next GE as long as he remains convicted. But he still remains as an MP because the Constitution says that an MP who has been convicted does not lose his seat until all of his appeals have been exhausted, and if there's a pardon, until the pardon is disposed of.
Okay, understood. Thank you so much. That was Lawyer New Sin Yu helping us clarify some of the uncertainties or a lack of clarity around the verdict that was the decision of the Court of Appeal today. We're going to take a quick break. More on Consider This after this. Stay tuned.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan
dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu
balik kepada support system. This is orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Asrama Mahat Tahfiz Jawaban.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. AWANI 745 lebih awal dari biasa. Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan
dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada support system. This is
Orang yang
action.
membuat polisi.
Kalau itu
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kuttan. We're discussing the Court of Appeal's decision today to uphold the verdict that found Najib Razak guilty of all 7 charges relating to the 42 million ringgit from SRC International. What implications might this ruling have on Najib Razak's political future? Political anthropologist and consultant Dr. Sophie Lemay joins us now. She's the editor of a book series titled Malaysian Politics and People. Sophie, you wrote an opinion piece for South China Morning Post, and it was titled, Forget 1MDB, Could Najib Razak be Malaysia's next Prime Minister? And in that opinion piece, you make the argument that Najib had somehow managed to garner popularity by creating a narrative of nostalgia for a more prosperous pre-pandemic times. And if I may quote the article, Najib may or may not become the next Prime Minister, but now, more than ever, everything seems possible, end quote. I'm just wondering whether today's verdict might have changed the equation.
Good evening. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. I think that, you know, when we're talking about this narrative, actually, we have to understand that in order for a story to take, right, you need to have kind of a dynamic between the one who is telling you the storyteller, and the people who are listening to it. So there is this dynamic, and I think that today's decision is not changing this dynamic. For the one who have been permeable to this narrative, who has kind of embraced it, the verdict of today is actually confirming this idea that has been developed by Najib and its line of defense in the eye of the public, that this entire trial is a political trial. It's an orchestration against him. It's an invention from Mahathir Mohamad, who wanted to take power. Again, we're talking here about narrative. We're talking here about perception, and that might differ from fact. It might be as well just a personal perception, right? When we're talking about Najib and his supporters. So I think today's popularity is still there, at least among his supporters. He looks like someone who is being, harassed even more, who is even more combative. We've seen him yesterday, doing prayers and trying to show that, he was this honest, true to the heart leader who was really trying to go through this very hard time, which is, we have to give him a very hard time.
Well, Sophie, we can ask the question of who I suppose. We know that dozens And I underline that dozens of people turned up at the courts today, true believers. But does it extend beyond that? And if it does, what evidence do we have of the depth or breadth of his support, whether in the general public or in UMNO, which is, of course, the most important vehicle for Najib if he seeks to return to power?
So I think that, it's always something very hard to measure, the support, right? And even more in a context of a pandemic where we have seen a lot of limitation on public gathering. The other aspect is that even when we do have a public gathering allowed, we do know that there is a common practice in Malaysia that is to actually pay supporters to attend ceramah and all political events. So it's always a little bit hard to kind of like take the temperature on the ground and to see, how much support a leader can gather. We've seen that Najib has an extremely active social media. He's actually pretty good. He has a very good team of communication on social media. What happened in the past few months and even more during the pandemic and during the lockdown is that a lot of the statements of Najib were related to economy, so quite away from the cases itself. And it did make sense. A lot of statements that he was making, ideas that he brought, forward in the public were actually pretty good. So the interesting thing is that we have seen people who, of course, did not support him, were very keen on having him, convicted and removed entirely from the political scene, to start to, admit that, well, the guy actually knows what he's talking about. So that actually kind of created a new kind of vibe, if I may say, about, the Najib Razak kind of reinvention, as I call it. So now we have seen in the court some of his supporters being there. I have seen tonight, as I was walking in Bangsa, actually, a little boy who was wearing this Bosku, Apamalu Bosku T-shirt, a 3-year-old maybe, which was quite odd in the Bangsa area. It was a little bit funny. So there are still people out there who do believe that he's innocent, that he was the best leader ever. And one of the reasons is that in a country where the social system is pretty weak, a leader who actually use that kind of medium to gain popularity is seen as an alternative to, the absence of a proper welfare state. So that explains part of the popularity that he has been to maintain, because Najib was giving a lot of money. He was giving BRIM, he was giving, small allowance that is in no way an equivalent to a proper welfare system, but it's what he was doing. And it's what he's remembered for. So in this context, and it's what I was explaining in the piece I wrote for the South China Morning Post, is that in a time where people are being struggling so hard because of the pandemic, and it's a universal problem, and there is this nostalgia of the pre-COVID time. And it turns out that the pre-COVID time is the time of Najib. We had a short time with Mahathir, but economy was not thriving then because we had this big change and a lot of uncertainties and the stop of the BRIM, the allowance given by the previous government. So people today are kind of like remembering those days, and those were the good old days, if I may quote.
Right. If I may move from the supporters of Najib Razak to perhaps his political competitors or even his compatriots within UMNO, and I'm just wondering how UMNO and the UMNO hierarchy might digest the verdict today. Will he be seen to be weakened within UMNO, and might that give who might benefit from a weakened Najib Razak?
Well, that's the thing, Najib Razak is a name, he's a brand, and he has money. Despite whatever we might say, he's still a very, very heavy weight in the party and in the Malaysian political scene. So it is difficult to dismiss him entirely, because we know that he does have popularity in the party. He still has some of the base that might not have a proper understanding as well of the case. The case is extremely complex. It has been going on for a while already, and not everybody has read, $1 billion will, or so it is a complex case. We've seen as well that the political memory of people is rather short. That is not just Malaysia; it is a universal phenomenon. And we have seen, how someone who was labeled as an autocrat for many years, I'm talking about Mahathir Mohamad, managed to come back on a democratic program supported by a democratic movement. So we have seen cases.
Sophie, you also in your piece make reference to the win in Malacca. There are people who say that that is not solely Najib's doing, or that, and in fact, in the kind of official narrative of UMNO, that isn't necessarily attributed to entirely to Najib. I mean, is there still much more work to be done for Najib to create the narrative in which he is indispensable to UMNO and its success, especially in the upcoming general election?
I think that the narrative that is indispensable is there and exists already. The question is whether the reality is going to meet the story or not. So this is when then the problem can start. It's when, the story that you're building or that you successfully build suddenly does not fit the reality anymore. So the pragmatism of UMNO might not always embrace the narrative of Najib. So of course, and we know that and we've seen it, the way that the story over the Malacca win has been built might not totally reflect the reality of the numbers of the ground. And I do know where the critics are coming from. And it is very true. But again, we're talking about the perception and how we twist story and history, right? So we have, of course, other leaders in UMNO who are trying to rise. So, well, we're not talking about Zahid because, he's kind of in the same boat with Najib and he's embezzled in corruption cases as well. So we have Matt Hassan is an option, but then we don't have so many alternatives as well with this level of popularity. Whether you have a popularity because in a good or in a bad way, it's still popularity. So you can easily switch this kind of thing one way or another. So what's going to happen in the next few weeks and few months in UMNO is going to be very interesting because we're going to see that more clearly, whether UMNO leaders are going for political kill, of course, and definitely trying, to push Najib away, or whether they will still kind of play with his popularity and try to benefit from it as much as they can. But what we have to remember as well, and it's the last thing, is that the existence of Najib Razak as a infamous leader, ignominious criminal, is actually something that has helped the opposition to come together. And the moment that Najib disappears, then it's going to be much, much more complicated as well for the opposition to unite, on one common agenda.
Right. Thank you so much, Sophie. That was political anthropologist Sophie Lemaire wrapping up this episode of Consider This. Thank you so much for watching the show. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
See you same time tomorrow. Good night.